While China and the United States had seen societal cultural communication, namely through the 1848 California gold rush and the following 1882 immigration ban of Chinese to America, distinct foreign relations between the two actors truly instigated through the Boxer Rebellion. Beginning with the Qing dynasty's defeat of the Opium Wars in 1848, China bore witness to a century of humiliation in which industrialized foreign powers encroached its national sovereignty through the establishment of enclaves throughout the coast of the China Sea. The Chinese government eventually sided with popular anti-imperialist jingoism, leading to America and other nation-states sending forces of their own to dismantle these newly installed policies. The US's role in the rebellion began a relationship with China built on distrust of Western foreign policy and is in turn indelible to the foundations of the US-China relationship. Simultaneously, the US proposed an open-door policy among those involved in the conflict. The open-door notes dispatched in 1899 to the European powers with spheres of influence within the Middle Kingdom stipulated equal access on all trade nodes within the China Sea, as well as granting the Chinese government liberty on tariffs. As well as being detrimental to the American East Asian foreign policy for the first half of the 20th century, the open door policy likewise formulated a US-China partnership built on trade that would dominate its relationship into the 21st century. From this, we can argue the events between 1899 and 1901 were the foundations of the US-China relationship. Following the Allied victory in the First World War, the 66th US Congress subsequently voted against joining the multinational institution of the League of Nations in January 1920, rejecting its position as a world power and opening the likelihood for another mass conflict. The open door policy was eventually broken by the 1931 Japanese invasion of the newly found Republic of China territory of Manchuria. The League's commission of the 1931 Lytton Report acknowledged the Japanese of aggression, but likewise failed to impose any strict sanctions or military action on the empire. Much of this was a consequence of the legitimacy of the League of Nations through the US's non-membership. Entering World War II immediately after the 1942 Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, the conflict culminated in 1945 with Western superiority under American leadership, as well as the liberation of Chinese territory from Axis occupation. What followed was a post-war economic boom among most countries, with unprecedented rise in employment and GDP growth. Contrarily, the end of the occupation reconvened China in the cusp of a civil war between Republicans and Communists. Despite US transportation aiding Republican forces in maintaining key cities such as Shanghai and Beijing, as well as most railway lines, the Communist faction under Mao Zedong was victorious in 1949. With all of mainland China conquered while the island of Taiwan remained under nationalist governments, relations between the United States and the newly formed People's Republic of China were broken down for decades.
After the Second World War, the United States did not recognise the People's Republic of China as a state, and instead held relations with the Republic of China based in Taiwan. The PRC was not recognised officially until 1979, when President Nixon was in charge, who eventually was able to form a strong relationship with Chairman Mao, leading to Nixon transferring diplomatic recognition of China from Taipei to Beijing. One main reason as to why there were little to no relations with the PRC was because of the Cold War fear of communism in America, and due to Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution that took place, which led to Chinese isolationism. The only real US-Chinese relation issue in this time was the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, with America backing the Republic of Korea, who were fighting to protect the Korean Peninsula against what is now North Korea, who were backed by the PRC at the time. Another war which took place in Southeast Asia later on was the Vietnam War. However, there is not much to say about US-Chinese relations here, as the war was predominantly an America and South Vietnam versus North Vietnam issue. During the 1970s and in the build-up to the end of the Cold War, things were looking up for US-Chinese relations, including the establishment of the United States Liaison Office in Beijing in 1973. Through the Liaison Office, America was able to reaffirm American interest in China through trade, with both Presidents Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter having an influence on this. This strengthened some relations until 1989, when the violent suppression of protests occurred in Tiananmen Square, leading to President George H.W. Bush implementing economic sanctions and suspension of weapons exports due to the Chinese violation of human rights. From this period until 9/11, their relations were still very touch and go, with Clinton not progressing much as president. However, George W. Bush's shift from America's biggest threat being China to Al-Qaeda after 9/11 led to the two countries becoming closer, and in many respects China became a US ally. partly due to the solidarity shown by China as 2 Chinese citizens had died during the attack, as well as China also fighting against Muslim separatists in Xinjiang. These ties were further developed by Barack Obama, who kept up Chinese relations through talks with Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping on climate change-related issues and the North Korean threat through their nuclear weapons program.
As we have seen, America and China's relationship goes back centuries. From the Chinese tea being thrown into Boston's harbour to Christopher Columbus's original mission to find a western passage to China. So where are we now with US-China relations? Well, first we must look at the facts and figures behind it. China has grown to become the world's second largest economy, behind the USA, although by some measures of purchasing power parity, it is the world's largest economy. In terms of the trading relationship, until the recent trade war, China was America's top trading partner. However, it has now dropped to third place. As you can see by the graph on the left, since trading relations resumed in 1985, Chinese imports into the US have grown precipitously, contributing to an enormous trade deficit on the United States' part. But as you can see, the Trump administration's tariffs have seen it decrease somewhat. This cooling in relations between the two largest economies can also be found in the relative investments made in each other's economies. As you can see on the graph on the right, state and private investment has declined to levels last seen in the early 2000s. As we have seen, China and the United States commercial relationship deepened for the best part of 50 years, over which time businesses' supply chains became inextricably linked. And even financially, as China grew its holdings of US securities to become the second largest holder. Certainly the prevailing wisdom in America of the 90s until the early 2010s was one of Francis Fukuyama's end of history, whereby as China increasingly opened up to trade and liberalized its economy, it would gradually democratize as the Soviet Union had done. However, hopes of a democratic convergence between the US and China have been eroded by the replacement of Hu Jintao by Xi Jinping. President Xi has revoked many of the liberalizing reforms enacted by his predecessors, clamped down on internal opposition through an anti-corruption drive, and curtailed international agreements guaranteeing the political freedom of Hong Kong. On the US side, populism, anger at offshoring of manufacturing jobs, Chinese state support of firms, and human rights concerns have seen an increase of negative views and attitudes about China, such as the concern that even in America's polarized politics, a bipartisan hawkish consensus has emerged towards China. It is certainly the case that as the Chinese economy has developed, the complementary nature of US and China exports has declined, as China has moved to making manufacturing higher value-added goods, thus giving way to greater economic competition between the two superpowers. China today sees itself as regaining its rightful place as the world's largest economy and greatest power, as it was in antiquity. Kishore Mahbubani's quote illustrates this fact nicely, and is a view that China champions. From China's perspective, their century of humiliation by Western powers is directly related to this aberration. China doesn't want any chance of a repeat of this. As such, it has been taking a greater role in global institutions, investing heavily in future technologies as part of its Made in China 2025, and tailoring its military modernization to curbing American power projection in the Western Pacific. America, on the other hand, is concerned with maintaining its preeminence, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. This will involve multilateralism, the deepening of alliances, particularly in Asia, as well as potentially new ones, with the likes of Vietnam, once a sworn enemy.
Much of the academic debate regarding Sino-US relations exists in the realm of speculative and normative thought. There are two notable debates in these realms. Will China's rise and the end of American primacy spark a second Cold War? And what stance should America take in response to this shift in the world order? Many realists argue for a hard stance against China and support tough Cold War-esque measures to prevent the end of the American unipolar world order. An example is the realist academic John Mearsheimer, who argues that the United States should seek to remain the most powerful state on the planet and must prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon in Asia. This sentiment is echoed by a large group of US policymakers, like Senator Josh Hawley, who takes a hardline stance against China and supports economic sanctions and anti-China rhetoric. Zhi Tianzhu uses the power transition theory to explain how a peaceful transition of power can be achieved and what steps should be taken to ensure the avoidance of a major war in the international system. Unlike the aforementioned US realists, Zhu argues that factors such as globalization, strong US-China economic ties, and a complex, but generally positive, foreign relation leads to the conclusion that the transition of power from the US to China will likely be a peaceful one. Su Tongyan argues similarly, describing US-China relations as a superficial friendship, where both parties claim to regard the other as a strategic partner and work together to mutual benefit, however, are simultaneously in competition to try and gain an advantage over each other. Yan concludes, arguing that this strategic competition of economics, diplomacy, and science will continue and therefore prevent military escalation from occurring. These speculative arguments play into the political debates on how the US should approach its policies on China, such as in economics. For example, following Trump's criticisms of China for devaluing their currency to promote unfair competition, the US Treasury designated China as a currency manipulator in their biannual report to Congress on currency manipulation in August 2019. This decision was then reversed in January 2020 ahead of trade talks. While some praised this move as an example of the president's negotiating prowess, others criticized the president for using political pressure to force the Treasury to misapply US trade law and gain an advantage in trade talks.
Joseph Biden, president-elect, ran his election campaign as the moderate who broadly opposed the policies of the incumbent President Trump. This stance means that it is likely that he'll bring about a significant change to US foreign policy. However, what this change will look like or what sort of President Biden will be is still uncertain due to the breadth of his support base. As the former vice president during the Obama administration, it may be expected that Biden will adopt an approach not too dissimilar to that of President Obama's, as suggested by his nomination of Antony Blinken to the post of Secretary of State, an individual who served as a Deputy Secretary of State under President Obama in his last years of the administration. The first years of the Obama administration saw a friendly diplomatic approach to China, one that encouraged greater cooperation. This lasted until 2014, however, when President Obama sought a more outspoken attitude towards China, focusing on perceived Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and East Asia more generally. With Antony Blinken serving as the Deputy Secretary of State in the final years of the Obama administration, it could be speculated that Biden might follow Obama's lead on taking a more generally outspoken approach towards Chinese aggression in South and East Asia. However, words may not be powerful enough, and Biden may be pressured into taking different action to maintain US dominance on the world stage. Within the Democratic Party, there are several opposing schools of thought in foreign policy. One group seeks to continue the Obama policies, whilst another, a more progressive group, seek a more diplomatic approach, one that utilizes US influence in the global economy when it comes to dealing with US-Chinese relations. Many experts within this progressive group have worked closely with Biden in recent months. This seems to indicate that Biden will adopt a stricter and more hostile attitude to when it comes to dealing with China and President Xi Jinping in future. However, it will be unlikely that he will continue to wage a trade war, as President Trump has sought to do, or that he will adopt an uncertain, flip-flopping approach of cooperation and rivalry that has also been seen during this Trump administration. To comprehend the long term of US-Chinese relations, one must pay particular attention to the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is a magnet of interest. An annual growth rate of over 9% for 24 years that increased amid a global financial crisis has gained the Chinese economy the label of a growth miracle. This rate of growth, if maintained, is a threat to US economic supremacy. However, the story of the Chinese economy is far from miraculous. The charade of economic strength hides the mass accumulation of debt that is destabilizing the Chinese economy, making many economic forecasters and independent observers fearful of a future financial crisis in the country. This hidden debt and potential future instability seems to assure US economic supremacy for the foreseeable future. This will enable the US to maintain its dominance over China in the global and regional affairs if US foreign policy is managed properly. Additionally, it should hinder China from being a major threat to US interests at home and abroad.